Welcome to the closing plenary session, the Indo-Pacific of Tomorrow and International Response. My name is Tomiko ICHIKAWA, Director General, the Japan Institute of International Affairs. I am truly honored to moderate this session, which is the last session of the second Tokyo Global Dialogue with such distinguished panelists. As their names speak for themselves, I will only introduce the panelists very briefly in alphabetical order. Her Excellency, Ambassador Delia Domingo Albert. Ambassador Albert was former Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, and she is currently Senior Advisor, SGV Ernst & Young. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your participation. And Mr. Peter Jennings, Executive Director, Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Mr. Jennings, welcome. Mr. Sanjoy Joshi, Chairman, Observer Research Foundation, ORF, in India. Welcome. General H.R. McMaster, former Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and currently the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Bernard and Susan Luto Fellow at the Freeman Spongler Institution, and lecturer at Stanford University School of Business. Sorry for long title, but you are known to everyone general. Welcome, thank you very much. Dr. John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science, the University of Chicago. Professor, thank you for your participation. And Ambassador Kenichiro Sasae, my boss, President, the Japan Institute of International Affairs. And Professor Zhang Yunlin, Professor and Member, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Dean, Institute of International Studies, Shandong University. Thank you very much for all the panelists for agreeing to take part in the last session of Tokyo Global Dialogue. This closing plenary will focus on the Indo-Pacific of tomorrow, as I mentioned at the beginning. The question we would like to ask in this session is about possible policy choices for Japan, countries in this region, and the international community in the face of the strategic transformation in this region. So please allow me a couple of minutes to present what topics were discussed in the previous sessions. What I'm going to read out now is not a comprehensive summary, but just a brief sketch of some salient points in these discussions up until the end of yesterday. So the discussions in these sessions have centered around the intensifying US-China confrontation and the strategic competition, and the consequences of these developments to the Indo-Pacific region. The US-China relations are expected to remain tense and may even deteriorate further over issues such as human rights. The tensions are considered to be structural and could intensify in the next 2 decades, during which China's GDP is expected to catch up and may surpass that of the US. Attention was also drawn to the ideological aspect of the US-China competition. The possibility of US-China cooperation on global issues, such as climate change, is recognized, but its positive impact on the overall bilateral relations may be limited. Both the US and China consider that the other side is increasing provocations. Such opposing views are also reflected on how to interpret the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, and the Quad, cooperation among the US, Japan, Australia, and India. From the US point of view, these initiatives are in response to China's actions and policies. China believes they are meant to preserve the US strategic superiority in the region. Escalation of the US-China confrontation is foreseen in the Western Pacific, the South China Sea, and especially around Taiwan. Development of such confrontation into a real military conflict should be avoided. It is important, therefore, to revitalize the US-China dialogue and consultations for crisis management, risk reduction, and confidence building. There is a sense of urgency that the risk of nuclear weapons being used is the highest since the end of the Cold War. The major powers need to take the lead in restoring the multilateral arms control system. The US-China relations over technology have aspects of competition and cooperation. Supply chain risk, as well as democracy and human rights from the perspective of data security, are important issues. However, current geotechnology competition between the US and China may not necessarily reach a state of decoupling or the Cold War 2.0. Regarding the great powers' influence in Southeast and South Asia, there are risks of further decoupling in this region, with dependence on China in economy one part, and the US in security on the other. The multipolar dynamic of this region is important, and the regional cooperation needs to be enhanced to maintain stability. The ASEAN centrality may face questions of efficacy in responding to specific challenges, but it has been contributing to long-term stability. European countries' interests in the Indo-Pacific is growing, but Europe's position as a security actor in this region is not clear. How to strike the balance between normative values, such as human rights, and economic interests in relation to China poses a serious challenge. Strengthening the cooperation among democratic states is important, but questions are asked about how to go beyond the symbolic and what format could be effective for operationalization. The FOIP may be too broad as a notion, while Quad is clear-cut. Russia opposes the FOIP as a policy of containment of China and itself. Russia is trying to counter this by promoting its own greater Eurasian concept and pivot to the East. But the tangible outcome of these policies in Asia remains to be seen. The Middle East region faces its own strategic issues with the shifting positions of the recent US administrations. The American presence in the region has declined, reflecting its shift to Asia. The Biden administration's re-engagement with Iran, especially on the JCPOA, is closely watched with divided views in the region. While multilateralism is facing a crisis, it is important to build upon the examples of functioning cooperation on the ground in response to the pandemic. On the climate change, early actions of the Biden administration are encouraging, but achieving the Paris Agreement goals will be extremely challenging. And finally, regarding Japan's role, there is trust and the expectation for Japan to lead the cooperation that would or could transcend the US-China confrontation, in particular at multilateral fora, such as G20. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to get the full readout from the two sessions of today, which are, of course, very important. Just let me summarize from my understanding what was discussed. In Northeast Asia, North Korea, Taiwan, and the East China Sea were focused. North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities have improved in the last few years. Tensions are rising around Taiwan. China is also stepping up its provocation around the Senkaku Islands. The intensifying confrontation between the US and China will further deteriorate security situation in this region, but at the same time, it is really important to maintain the peaceful situation in the region. The shifting strategic landscape in this region has its impact on the territorial and maritime issues and the rule of law. The discussions also focused on the role of international law, in particular in relation to the South China Sea at the time of strategic confrontation. Sorry for taking up so much time, but there have been such rich discussions in the previous sessions. So, based on these discussions which already took place in previous sessions, we are looking forward to the discussions in this session by the eminent 7 panelists. So I would like to ask these panelists to make their own initial remarks, limited to 7 minutes each, so that we can have enough time for discussion after your initial remarks. So I would like to start with Professor Mearsheimer. Dr. Mearsheimer, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tomiko, for your introduction. And thank you to the organizers of the conference for asking me to be here this evening in Chicago, but I assume sometime in the day in Tokyo. I think that the distinguishing feature of the Indo-Pacific region in the decades ahead will be the US-China competition. I think those two countries will engage in an intense security competition, and there will be a serious chance of a hot war between them. Now, the question is, why is this the case? The first reason is that China is going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's very important to understand what China is doing today is it's imitating the United States. It wants to be, for very good reason, the most powerful state in Asia by far. The Chinese know full well what happened when they were weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. The Chinese understand full well that the best way to survive in the international system is basically to be Godzilla. And in the present context, that means being a regional hegemon. And in addition to being the most powerful country in Asia, they have a deep-seated interest in pushing the Americans first out beyond the first island chain and then out beyond the second island chain. They have a deep-seated interest in getting the Americans out of Asia. And I don't blame them one bit. As an American, I like the Monroe Doctrine. I do not like the idea of distant great powers coming into the Western Hemisphere. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we don't like great powers in the Western Hemisphere, there's no reason the Chinese should like the United States sitting on their doorstep. So they're going to try and push us out. They're going to try and be a regional hegemon in Asia. And they're going to do this in large part because it's the best way to survive in the international system. As you all know, there's no higher authority that a state can turn to when it gets into trouble in international politics. And that often happens because there are states out there that are very powerful and have malign intentions. And if you run into one of those states and you dial 911, as we say in the United States, there's nobody at the other end. What that means is you have to take care of yourself. And the best way to take care of yourself is to be by far the most powerful state in your region of the world. Now, the Chinese have a second reason to want to be very powerful, and that is they are not a status quo power when it comes to the territorial situation in Asia, and they want to change the arrangements in the Pacific region and along the India-China border in ways that work to their advantage. They want to control the East China Sea, and they want to take the Senkaku Islands back. They think the Senkaku Islands are the Diao Islands, and they belong to China. They plan to make Taiwan part of China. They plan to turn the South China Sea into a giant Chinese lake. And they plan to settle where the line of control is, the line of actual control is between India and China on terms that are favorable to India. I don't blame them one bit. If I were in Beijing, I'd want to do the same thing. This brings me to my second point. There's another important player in this game, and that's the United States of America. And it's very important to understand that the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. From our point of view, there's only one possible regional hegemon allowed on the planet, and that is the United States of America. And in the 20th century, we went to great lengths to put 4 potential peer competitors on the scrap heap of history: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. You can rest assured that the United States will go to enormous lengths, whether Donald Trump is in the White House, Joe Biden is in the White House, or I'm in the White House, to make sure that China does not become a regional hegemon, does not become a peer competitor. And of course, there are many countries in Asia, this includes countries like Australia, Japan, India, South Korea, just to name a few, that have a profound interest in making sure that China does not become a regional hegemon and that the United States is fully capable of containing China. So what's going to happen moving forward is you're going to have this intense security competition between the United States and a handful of allies in Asia on one side and the Chinese on the other side. It's going to look a lot like the Cold War did. Let me conclude by saying that there'll be 2 fundamental differences between Cold War I and Cold War II. The first difference is that Cold War I was mainly a military competition, simply because there was not much economic intercourse between the 2 sides. In this case, which is more analogous to the situation in Europe before World War I, you're going to have a lot of economic intercourse, and you're also going to have side by side with that economic intercourse, security competition or military competition. All of this is to say that the containment policy that the Americans push forward will have a military dimension and an economic dimension, which was not the case during the Cold War, which was largely about military competition. The second point is I actually think this competition is much more dangerous than the competition we had during the Cold War. The principal point of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was on what we called the Central Front. It was right in the heart of Europe. And there in the heart of Europe, we had 2 giant military forces, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, with thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, and thousands of nuclear weapons. And whenever we ran war games during the Cold War, it was almost impossible to get a conflict started. Why? Because the thought of 2 massive armies armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons bumping into each other in a war probably meant that everybody was going to get vaporized, and nobody wanted to get vaporized. So we had this remarkably stable situation in the heart of Europe where the Soviets and the Americans were eyeball to eyeball with each other. If you fast forward to the present and you look at the geography in Asia today, what you see is no equivalent of the Central Front. And where are the potential flashpoints? The East China Sea, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the India-China line of control. Well, these are all areas where you could easily imagine a war breaking out. I don't think it's likely that the United States and China are going to fight in the South China Sea at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think it is possible. I can imagine it quite easily happening because it's out in the water. It's not on the Central Front. I can even imagine nuclear weapons being used out in the water. Again, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying it's a real possibility in ways that I think was not the case during the Cold War. So you remember when I started, I said that what I think we're definitely going to get moving forward is an intense security competition with a serious potential of a hot war. And what I've tried to emphasize in my final point is that this security competition might very well end up in a shooting match. And for that reason, we are going to have to go to enormous lengths in the years ahead to make sure that doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Miyashima. You put this session wonderfully into a very broad perspective and quite rich elements in it, including the comparison with the Cold War I. I'm sure we are going to hear a lot about how each of the panelists would see the current situation and the future. And since you talked a lot about China, I think it's really fortunate to have next in my list of the panelists to speak Professor Jiang Yunlin. I think you have quite a lot to counter-argue or add from the Chinese point of view. Professor Zhang, please.
Okay, thank you. First, let me express my sincere thanks to JIIA to invite me to attend this forum. Let me give some points that since today we are discussing about the region. Let me first retrospect to some thing happened in the Asia Pacific from the past Asia Pacific to today's Indo-Pacific. After Second World War, the Asia Pacific was divided. And then two things happened. One is increasing economic linkages make the two sides of Asia Pacific closer. And then the movement push for the regional cooperation. Finally, we have integrated cooperative Asia Pacific with APEC as a main foundation to bring all of us together. But things changed. Start from Obama administration, and with the China's rise, and Obama announced this TPP strategy, exclude China, and aiming at China's economic competition. And then during the Trump administration, it announced that Indo-Pacific a strategy, exclude China again, with the strategy against China's military rise. This, of course, Japan play a very, very active role to push this Indo-Pacific. Though from beginning it had a different idea, but now it seems they are more like together with the United States. So now today, what we have now coming to Indo-Pacific, we have a divided one. From an integrated cooperative Asia-Pacific to a divided Indo-Pacific. So I think the question one that is, what the Indo-Pacific for? Is it a strategy to embrace a rising India or get India together against China? We don't know. But however, it's exclude China. So that is why China put a question mark on this Indo-Pacific question of the strategy. And also called on this free and open Indo-Pacific, what does it mean? And Quad, what does it mean? And, any country has a free to make some groups and defend themselves, and then, but it is not very clear. It's aligned with the U.S.-led strategy against China's rival, or for what? This is, I think, from China's side, we are thinking about very much. We have many ways if we embrace or engage a rising India, but this until now, this Indo-Pacific strategy seems is for the different consideration. So the challenge and danger, that is how far this divided region will go. So we want to have a divided region, or we want to have an integrated cooperative region again, and which I think surely it's a big question we should think about. I remember that former State Secretary Bauer said, if you take China as an enemy, it's an enemy. And if you think take China as a not enemy, you have many ways to engage and cooperate. So this is, I think, the crucial situation now. The last point is now we have many common challenges now, not just China-U.S. strategic competition. We have COVID-19 epidemic. We have economic slowdown. So we have a rising protectionism and extremism and so on and so forth. So we need a cooperative strategy rather than a divided one. So dialogue and cooperation is still the key, like or not. But this is the only way we can solve our problems and challenges. But I don't think it's a good idea if only, ask for cooperation with China on global issues. And on the regional issue, you take China as a rival, excluded the strategy. I think is which make China distrust all this kind of overall strategy thinking. So I think we are in a crucial, time. And since we have so many common problems, and finally, if we can, as I mentioned by John just now, that China has its own thinking and strategy, for instance, because of the history, because of the, its existing issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and many others to handle about. We have differences. But the question is, as a Chinese, I will always ask, so whether China really want to dominate as the U.S. happened in the past, I don't think so, because there are so many its own problems and to handle and to manage and to solve. And China really want to have a cooperative strategy, cooperate with the United States and with others, and want to have a stable region and so on and so forth. So China wants to have dialogue, wants to, through the negotiation to solve their issues, like what happened quite recently between China and India after some tension, and finally they find a way, to manage the that's based on the negotiations and patient, dialogue and cooperation. And they decided to retreat their military forces to avoid the big clash and tensions in the future. But each side understands it's not an easy issue to solve their territory, dispute, because in the past long history, which I think probably need a very long time. But as China, India agreed in the past, they all realized they have to keep a calm border and open for dialogue and cooperation, and carefully, slowly, and manage these negotiations. And again, so I hope this kind of, and even as South China Sea issue, Taiwan issue probably differently, but if we recall the past experience, how China, U.S. had a mutual better understanding, handle this complex issue, and it seems there is a better future to handle the issues. And if you push the situation to an extreme point, they make something happen out of control. And South China Sea and I think the similar issue. If we can sit down, talk about and how to handle this emerging new issues, all the issues, and still I hope like what China ASEAN continue to insist to do, and we may find a way and to solve it. So if you have, based on this strategic competition, and stop China to do something and so on, and regrouping some forces, contended, and things may go to the opposite, which we don't expect from all of us. Finally, point, I think though there are so many complex issues we have to handle, and personally, I still have some hope that China, US could manage their, strategic differences. And John said, the probably more danger than the Cold War I. And since at that time, we all realized we can't afford at all. But today, again, we also should realize we can't afford any kind of big confrontation and war, because it's too dangerous and also can totally change our future. So many questions. I hope that this Indo-Pacific strategy should be, again, as Asia-Pacific, and move to a more cooperative, integrated, rather than divided. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for your insight, and also responding to some of the points raised by Dr. Miyashima. I think now we got a very starting kind of baseline from some points of view from the US side and Chinese side. And I also picked up some very interesting probably points to discuss later. Professor Zhang, you talked a lot about India, but please allow me to go south first before going to west. So I'd like to ask now Her Excellency Ambassador Albert for her initial remarks. Ambassador Albert, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good morning. I would like to thank the Japan Institute for International Affairs for the invitation to address the closing session of this year's Tokyo Global Dialogue and for its interest in ASEAN. I am deeply honored to be part of such a distinguished group of academics in this panel. I'm also glad that a woman's voice has been included in this session. As I am spending some time in Singapore, let me start with an update on ASEAN by referring to a recent article by Professor Tomiko, an eminent thought leader respected throughout ASEAN, and the chairman of the Center for International Law and the National University of Singapore. In his recent article a week ago, he entitled it "Coup, COVID, and Other Tests of ASEAN Unity." Professor Ko identified the 4 challenges facing ASEAN today: Myanmar challenge, the COVID challenge, the economic challenge, and cohesion challenge. Let me focus on the cohesion challenge as we look into the outlook on the Indo-Pacific document, which I feel is one of the most important documents adopted by ASEAN leaders at their summit meeting in June of 2019. To my mind, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific should be taken for what it is, namely an outlook, a view with possibilities, notably because ASEAN accepted the term Indo-Pacific in its official lexicon. What is important is that Indo-Pacific has been incorporated into ASEAN security discourse alongside other geopolitical processes such as East Asia and the Asia-Pacific. For ASEAN, the Outlook document serves a special purpose, namely a common script to guide each member as they face certain external pressures. It also reassures them and others that it is, quote, not aimed at creating new mechanisms or replacing existing ones. For the past 50 years, ASEAN has designed a clever and strategic architecture to engage with its neighbors and friends, known as the dialogue process. Since 1975, dialogue partnerships with ASEAN have focused on economic and development cooperation, delivering tangible results to the people of the region. Meanwhile, additional platforms for wider and deeper cooperation, with ASEAN leading the mechanisms such as the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, and others have evolved. I believe Japan is a participant in these processes. The AOIP focuses on strengthening and optimizing these ASEAN-led mechanisms, provided the states with strategic discussions and practical cooperative activities that can be pursued in these ASEAN-led mechanisms. Meanwhile, ASEAN has been focused in working towards building an ASEAN community, envisioned to be attained in 2025. To get 10 independent states with diverse backgrounds, with individual national interests, to create that community has been very high on the ASEAN agenda. ASEAN does not have a supranational entity that would work and decide for everyone. It remains to be described by some as an intergovernmental body. It is only when everyone feels convinced and comfortable that the common good is being served will such a consensus emerge. For example, it took 25 years for ASEAN to adopt the word or accept the word called integration into its vocabulary from its cooperation roots. As a result, the ASEAN Free Trade Area was only possible when the members felt ready and comfortable with it. ASEAN continues to be mindful of the concerns and capacities of its members. I can sympathize with ASEAN's focus in building the ASEAN community as its priority. After all, it has been a long-standing commitment to its 700 million people who have high expectations from a dynamic region with a promising future. Finally, when the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific document, while it remains focused on economics and development issues, the outlook signals determination on the part of ASEAN to play a relevant role in the security discourse, particularly in view of the increasing uncertainties in the security strategic situation that's facing the region today. ASEAN will continue to contribute to these strategic discussions while maintaining its neutral and pragmatic approaches in the face of rising competition for influence between the two powers over the region. In conclusion, Professor Ko, in his article, said that while countries, and he reflects what we think in the region, that while countries can be closer to one great power or another, as a group and as one ASEAN, we must remain united and neutral. This way, ASEAN can maintain the trust it has earned globally over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your very succinct but quite very insightful explanation about how the ASEAN countries work and how ASEAN countries perceive the current situation. And I'm very also grateful for your presence in this session as females' voice matters. Thank you very much, Ambassador. So let me go further south, and I'd like to invite Mr. Jennings for his point of view from Australia. Mr. Jennings, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, there is no further south to go after Australia. My thanks to Kenichiro Sasai for the opportunity to speak with you, and congratulations for staging such an interesting dialogue. I'll go straight to my substantive points. I have 7 minutes, so I'd like to make 7 points about the Indo-Pacific of tomorrow. First, and this is my most optimistic point, we've seen a welcome trend towards increased cooperation among democratic countries. I expect this trend will continue, driven by a growing challenge from authoritarian regimes. In the Asia-Pacific of tomorrow, I believe that one of the most important emerging security institutions is the strengthening of trilateral cooperation between Australia, the United States, and Japan. This grouping has the potential to become an alliance in all but name, and it will take on the heavy lifting required to sustain regional stability. The Quad has a good deal of promise and interest, but I think it's the core trilateral relationship which will lead on defence and security cooperation. Our job is to convince a wider network of friends, allies and neighbours that there is an alternative to being coerced by authoritarian regimes. The alternative is strong democracies able to stand on their own feet and willing to work with each other. So much for the optimism. Now I go to some areas of concern. My second point is that while some key democracies are working together, democracy is under substantial threat in the Indo-Pacific. In Southeast Asia, we have 2 democracies that have been subject to military coups. In other countries, we see corruption, and the covert undermining of political systems by Beijing is making the region look more fragile than at any time since the mid-1960s. This is clearly a moment for democratic renovation in the Indo-Pacific. Anything that the established democracies can do to strengthen the position of good governance and the rule of law is critically important. Third, over the next decade, and probably beyond, the Indo-Pacific is going to be the epicentre of strategic competition between countries that will either align with the democracies or with the authoritarian regimes. So there will be trade, there will be technology and other interconnections between these 2 camps. But fundamentally, we're at the start of a new strategic rift. No country will be able to avoid this or easily balance between the 2 camps. Now, if we really face a China choice, as an Australian colleague of mine has famously described it, we had all better choose carefully. Australian governments have vigorously argued for over a decade that a policy choice between biasing our interests towards Beijing or Washington was neither realistic nor necessary. But few people today would think that that balancing act is still possible. Now that brings me to my 4th point, which is that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is locked onto its wolf warrior course of action. There is going to be no easy return to the days of peaceful rise. In some respects, the rise of the CCP's wolf warrior mode has been beneficial because we can all see what we're dealing with now. It's essential to understand that Beijing's strategic objective, as John Mearsheimer said at the start of our session, is to dominate the wider region, exclude the United States, weaken those countries that would push back against the CCP, and demand acquiescence to their priorities. That's the fundamental strategy. There is no secret to it. It's rather openly acknowledged by Beijing. Now, my 5th point is that we need to be working more consciously to ensure that all countries understand that reality. I do worry that our European friends sometimes fail to appreciate the nature of the entity they deal with when it comes to the CCP. Beijing is far enough away from Europe that it can be possible to still prioritize economic opportunity over strategic risk. My own view, in fact, is that many private sector firms have already reevaluated the cost and higher risk of doing business in and with the PRC. And some governments may be slower to that realisation. My sixth point is that, separate but connected to the China story, is the rapid emergence of new technology with the potential to be strategically game-changing. Now, the list will be familiar to you all, but quantum computing, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and autonomous systems in military and civil applications offer, I believe, a relatively near-term 5 to 10-year horizon within which there will be fundamental changes to how our societies function. So the Indo-Pacific is not just a global centre for strategic competition, it will also become the centre of technology competition as well. In that competition, there are forces that could fundamentally disrupt the strategic balance. Finally, my last point is to say we shouldn't lose sight of the short-term risks to regional security at the same time as we think about the medium-term future. Taiwan, the East and South China Seas, and North Korea all present near immediate risks to regional stability. A military clash in any of these areas would have the effect of jumping the region into a new state of Cold War, different to the last, but certainly highly dangerous. So in this sense, the future risks that we worry about, in fact, may be about to land on us in weeks and months rather than years. So my overall judgment is that the strategic picture for 2021 and beyond looks increasingly difficult to navigate. It's going to take calm leadership and a willingness to deepen collaboration between the major democracies to give us the platform to successfully deal with these risks. Thank you. That concludes my comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jennings, for enumerating your 7 points in 7 minutes. Quite succinct and quite clear-cut presentation. Thank you so much. So now let me go west, and I'd like to invite Mr. Sanjoy Joshi for his point of view from India. Mr. Joshi, please.
Thank you, ICHIKAWA-san, and thank you to the Tokyo Global Dialogue for getting me here with these eminent panelists to talk on this subject. We've had some excellent presentations, and I especially like Professor Mishimaima's insistence that the road ahead is tough and is going to require a lot of effort to go the extra mile to make sure that peace reigns in the area. So there are challenges, but as academician Zhang pointed out, India and China had conflicts on the LSE. The conflicts continue. There are differences. But the good sign is that the two sides have started climbing down. There is a process which is underway, bringing some kind of sanity to the area. And I hope these trends continue in the future, and there is maturity displayed by leadership to make sure that that is the way forward. Coming to the topic in hand, let me begin by saying that 2020, COVID-19 did not just afflict the world. The problem was it found us in a deeply sick world, in an already afflicted world. There was such a strong mood against multilateralism. We saw the Paris Accord come to naught, global trade being held hostage by trade wars. And all that the pandemic did was to undermine the only global institution meant to handle it, which was the World Health Organization. So 2020 has been an extremely difficult year. And we saw transformations that are actually tugging at some of our most fundamental societal norms, questioning our economic assumptions, our business principles, and even our economic arrangements. It is not just Chinese encroachments in disputed waters like the South China Sea and the East China Sea or across the Tibetan Plateau that worry us. At a more fundamental level, democracies are finding their fundamental principles challenged by new kinds of challenges. And we are seeing governments increasingly losing the trust of the ones they govern. Second, what has all this done to the Indo-Pacific? See, as far as this region is concerned, South Asia and ASEAN had for long learned the hard way. They've learned to look beyond the vicissitudes of great power rivalries and forge their own pathways. They learned it through the days of the Cold War. And the last 4 years perhaps have only driven that learning deep across other countries, including former allies of the US. We saw that as the transatlantic consensus wilted, France formulated its own Indo-Pacific strategy, with Germany and Netherlands following suit. And the EU now talks to discussing of a joint strategy. And the German proposal clearly has spelled out its concern in the proposal, a new bipolarity with fresh dividing lines across the Indo-Pacific, where it is seen as this new bipolarity is inimical to German interests. See, it is not only Chinese behavior today, but US leadership, which allies had started having doubts over. So yes, the new administration has come as a welcome change. But the fact remains that more and more countries in Southeast Asia have not wanted to be caught between the two strategic rivals. And today, even as the relationship between China and the US gets more nuanced, less belligerent, the core strategic divisions, as has been pointed out, the strategic divisions between the US and China remain very much there. Will the Biden administration continue with the Indo-Pacific policy of Trump, to my mind, is today become a moot question. The answer to that lies in the larger question of whether that is something any regional power should now be banking on. So we are in a position today where countries more fiercely than ever are going to be guarding their strategic autonomy. And yes, in the post-COVID world, as China becomes one of the first countries to register growth, an overarching Indo-Pacific strategic alliance with containment as its core today probably will have very few takers. So you have a situation where Trump, both because of and in spite of himself, may have succeeded in ensuring the birth of a new multipolar, multi-pronged Indo-Pacific alignment that may, in fact, be far more durable. My third point is that coming to this whole region, see, the China paradox is a paradox the world must confront. And the paradox is that on the one hand, should the world move forward to contain China, then being contained, China has no choice but to retreat into isolation. The problem is it is too big an economy, too much integrated over the past few decades into global value chains. And in spite of all glib talk of decoupling, it is the biggest market and the biggest exporter. And to hit China means, for most countries, hitting many of your own businesses. On the other hand, should the Chinese leadership so much as even attempt to deepen reform, go through the motions of building an open economy and liberal society, yes, it rivals the best and becomes a key strategic and economic rival to them. So the distrust whether the change in China, if it happens, is actually going to be real, is always a doubt that remains and lingers. And therefore, that is why the reason why democracies have come together to insist not on the motions of change, but on actual normative change, an unequivocal acceptance of the same rules-based international order by all players. And I say all. That is what is to be an idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific, or call it whatever. A rose is a rose by any other name. So how should countries in the region respond to these changes? What is the future for multilateralism? Well, as I began by saying, the pandemic did expose the fault lines of multilateral bodies. Therefore, today there is an opportunity, and I think the need, to seed many minilateral and plurilateral initiatives where the rising and middle powers of the region start pulling their weight to ensure a stable, rules-based global order. One that can curb the excesses of large powers and engage with the opportunities that all offer to the region. And that is why organizations like the Quad should really be seen in that light. So minilateralism means that narrower, usually informal initiative to address specific problems where fewer states sharing the same interest build their strategic coalitions, which are voluntary rather than mandatory. And they go on without negating or eliminating pre-existing multilateral commitments. So groupings like the Quad, which are issue-based cooperative mechanisms, help in facilitating the Indo-Pacific vision of countries like India, which is come out with Sagar, ensuring the growth of all and maintenance of a rule-based order. And with the ongoing pandemic, the issue of global health governance and vaccination drives have become an important concern. In the latest Quad meeting recently, we saw ministers reiterating their commitment to cooperate in addressing this challenge, enhancing access to affordable vaccines. The list of problems we have is endless. So rather than confronting each other across the LAC, there are larger issues at hand which we need to get together and solve. So ASEAN countries, my final point, between themselves have been championing the idea of these kinds of minilateral initiatives. And ASEAN informality has always been one of the key things. So that is where ASEAN centrality really comes in, and we in India place great importance, centrality. The idea of ASEAN centrality is important for us. So when we talk of ASEAN informality, the minilateralism, bilateralism, the kind of efforts Indonesia is making in Myanmar, they become important. They become important. It is a patchwork geometry that can strengthen the area, that can actually strengthen peace in the region. And finally, beyond these arrangements, in an increasingly complex world, public policy, global public policy networks are going to be one of the answers to the resulting institutional vacuum that has arisen at the global level. This vacuum needs to be filled. It'll take time to fill. But till then, these kinds of networks which you are participating in become extremely important. So that is, in my point, where various international organizations, states, civil society actors, and even the private sector come together to collaborate on and respond to an ever more complex global policy environment, which formal governmental or intergovernmental structures are either unable to come to grips with, or are themselves, in some case, either the perpetrators or victims of increased socioeconomic disintegration coupled with rapid technological change. So these are challenges which lie before us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi, for covering a quite wide-ranging topics from multilateralism to domestic and social economic aspects. You have, again, widened the scope of this debate. Thank you very much. So after listening to various views from the region, we'll go back to the US. On the West Coast, I understand, for General McMaster. General McMaster, the floor is yours, please.
Ohayo gozaimasu. It's good to see everyone. Thank you for the privilege of being with you and with Sasai-san, my good friend, with whom I worked with Yachi-san and Kono-san and Abe-san on the free and open Indo-Pacific. It was my favorite part of my job as National Security Advisor to work with my Japanese colleagues, and now to be the Japan chair at the Hudson Institute is a gift, to stay in contact with my dear friends. And we are at a very important moment in our history. And this conference could not be happening at a more important time. And as I listened to our colleagues on the panel, I was reminded of George Orwell's phrase in the dystopian novel 1984, that he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. And I couldn't help, as I listened to my colleagues from the United States, China, and India, that I think that there are very significant misunderstandings and maybe even some abuses of history that are leading to misunderstandings about the nature of this competition with the Chinese Communist Party. And I believe that these misunderstandings are in 4 areas and may even have afflicted this wonderful conference. First of all, we talk about dynamics between China and the United States as if China is monolithic. China is not monolithic. And the problem that we, in our free and open societies and our like-minded liberal democracies have, is not with China, is not with China's rise, it's with the aggressive policies of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's very, very important to make that distinction. The second misunderstanding, and this is how really almost all of the comments have been framed, maybe except for Peter's, is that, hey, this is really a problem between Washington and Beijing. And everybody else is just kind of caught in the middle of this. But I think if we just only consider kind of a highlight reel of the actions of the Chinese Communist Party since the beginning of the pandemic, we'll realize this is really not an issue. This is really not a competition between Washington and Beijing. Consider, for example, the Chinese Communist Party foisting this pandemic on the world by suppressing the news of human-to-human transmission, by shutting down internal travel before international travel, by persecuting the doctors and the journalists who were trying their best to ring the alarm bells about this epidemic that could have been contained and saved the world so much suffering. Consider then adding insult to injury with this wolf warrior diplomacy and portraying China's authoritarian model as superior to the models in our democratic and free market economic systems. Consider massive cyber attacks against our medical research facilities in the midst of the pandemic. Consider bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. Consider ramming Vietnamese vessels and sinking them in the South China Sea, and just last week giving orders to the Coast Guard to fire on vessels if they do not recognize what would be the greatest land grab, so to speak, in history, should China succeed in the South China Sea. Consider the threats toward Taiwan and toward the Senkakus and the violations of airspace. Consider the unprecedented campaign of economic coercion aimed at Australia. Consider a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang. Consider the extension of the Chinese Communist Party's repression to Hong Kong, and even just the most recent arrests, right, of 53 and then scores more freedom activists. And then consider Xi Jinping's statements. Hey, the concentration camps are great. I mean, we're going to put on additions to them because the Uyghurs love to be re-educated. Consider the statements that hostage taking is just an arm of our foreign policy, as the 2 Canadians remain incarcerated now for going on over 2 years. So is this really a problem between Washington and Beijing, or is this a problem between the free world and the Chinese Communist Party? Is this a choice between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, or is this a choice really, what I think it fundamentally is a choice between sovereignty and servitude? The third misunderstanding that I think is very important is that, hey, there really hasn't been much international cooperation on this. Even during the Trump administration, there was tremendous international cooperation, and I want to credit Japan for taking so much of the leadership. Establishing national.
Just a moment, General. We lost your audio. You may have muted yourself in your excitement.
Sorry, thank you.
Please unmute.
So no, I was just saying, consider.
We can continue to hear you, yes.
Thank you. Consider Japan's leadership in international fora in connection with investment standards and transparency standards for infrastructure investment. Consider the role that Japan played along with others across the Indo-Pacific region in joining, I think, 12 nations altogether in indictments against Advanced Persistent Threat 10, the Chinese Communist Party's main arm of industrial espionage. Consider the international cooperation now on recognizing the need to reverse Chinese subversion of international organizations, for example. So we have to build on this. And I can't agree with Peter more. I mean, our European friends need to stiffen their spine a bit. I think this comprehensive agreement on investment is just ridiculous. And I would just say to our friends, hey, let Huawei in, but please, if you do, ask yourself this question first. Do you really expect the Chinese Communist Party to treat your citizens better than they treat their own people? And so we are in a high stakes competition, and this fourth misunderstanding is one we have to correct as well. And that is that we're facing this Thucydides trap. And the Chinese Communist Party loves this, right? They love it because it poses really all of us across the Indo-Pacific region with this false dilemma. Hey, you can either accommodate the Chinese Communist Party and acquiesce to their efforts to establish a modern day tributary system in which one belt, one road means all roads lead to Beijing and it's a one-way toll road, or you're signing up for a disastrous conflict. I do not believe that's the case. What we can do is we can engage in transparent competition with these aggressive actions and policies of the Chinese Communist Party. And if we do that together, it's harder for them to kill one, Australia, to scare 100. And so it's time for all of us to work together to recognize that we have to build a better future for generations to come. And if the Chinese Communist Party succeeds in creating exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific, our world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. Finally, a few words about cooperation. Hey, we all need to cooperate. And I love it. It's an important narrative. But let's consider cooperation on climate change, energy security, environment, health, water, and food security. China is building 50 to 70 coal-fired plants a year and poisoning the world with carbon emissions. Second, counterterrorism. Of course, we have to cooperate on counterterrorism. China seems to be doing its best to create new generations, more terrorists, as they intern people into concentration camps and put them into forced labor in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China. Third, economic growth, fair and reciprocal trade. How about the continuation of unfair trade and economic practices and just the hypocrisy of that statement when China is engaged in really an exportation of its mercantilist model. The setting of debt traps and so forth under One Belt, One Road and so forth. Hey, how about cooperating on the threat from North Korea, the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world who is trying to get the most destructive weapons on earth? Well, China could solve that problem. China wanted to. But China sees North Korea as a wedge that it can use to wedge the United States off the peninsula as the first step in isolating its main regional competitor, Japan. So cooperation is great, but we have to be clear-eyed about it. And I think really, if you look at the declassified strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy that I had a hand in putting together, along with our partners in the region, I think that declassified approach is sound. It is transparent, and it is a way for us to avoid confrontation with the Chinese Communist Party and to continue to seek areas of cooperation. But let's do it with a clear-eyed view, and let's do it with a clear understanding of the present and reject, I think, some of the flawed interpretations of the past that are creating these misunderstandings. Thank you. I'm so glad to be part of this conference, and I really enjoyed the discussion so far, and I can't wait to hear from my friend Ken. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, General. I'm sure Professor Zhang will also have a lot to talk about after your intervention. But before that, and before going into the panel discussion, of course, we have my boss, Ambassador Sasae, who may want to make his own presentations or respond to some of the arguments already made. So, Ambassador Sasae, please.
Thank you, Tomiko-san. It is a great pleasure to see old friends and new friends joining this event. I like to, when I was listening to all the presentation preceding, all the memories of my service in the government, the flashback of the moment, talking to Chinese government, US government, ASEAN government, Australian governments, and all the others. And it's great to think back and think through and what will be the future Asia-Pacific. Now, I kind of agree. It could be possibly right when Professor Miyashima said that China is seeking to be a regional hegemon, apart from what China perceives themselves to be. It looks like from the outsiders. And when I had a private conversation with Chinese friend, on and off, they talk about the histories, past histories of humiliation, 100 years of Western invasion, and so forth, including Japanese. And then they talk about Chinese dream. I think Miyashima could be right. I think China won't be a number one competing with the United States, and they want to be a respected superpower, and not necessarily becoming like a Qin dynasty. And it's a more modern type of Chinese government, I hope. But we can't really, exclude or even be naive about the way China looks at the world, apart from their rhetorics and words, nice words, that they continue to look at the world in the order of the power. Power does matter. At the end, the power would dictate the relationship. But having said it, the question is that could we contain the China as somebody said it, or apart from the debate whether containment is the right policy or not, it is obvious, as Miyashima said, that Chinese economic power continue to grow, and military power would continue to grow anyway, and high tech would grow, and all these power putting together goes beyond the Soviet Union in the Cold War days. That is true, and that is scary. Why? Because China might not be looking at the world in the same way we look at, or China might not be seeking the governance mode as we are seeking. That is free and open democracy. I think that's the fundamental things. And so if there is all this competition, I think the first and foremost is how we would defend the free and open democracies in this part of the region. And that is the, I would say, the fundamental, background while we, Japan, are working on this free and open Indo-Pacific. And also working together with the United States and Australia and India for making sure that all these values, I would say our own core values, it's different from Chinese core values, but we need to defend. So we need to have some friends with the same values and interest to defend. And this FOIP and Quad is not an offensive one. It could be even inclusive, depending on how China would come around, and including how China will be adjusting the way it handles the domestic governance, and also the fundamental sort of discourse in the international relationship. And what do we do? I mean, what Japan does do, right? To be honest, we don't want to fight a war with China. Nobody is willing to do so. Even the United States is not willing to fight a war, and China is not. but the competition would continue. And as our Chinese friend, he's a nice friend of ours too. He's a liberal part of China, I believe. And there is a room for collaboration, obviously. And we don't want to get China excluded. And we want China to be part of our process. That's why this Indo-Pacific is an open process. But when we talk about open process, China need to have the similar orientations and values, we harbor. That will be taking time in terms of what's happening in domestic politics in China. And the year 2020 through 2022, I think there will be more authoritarian political base will be solidified. So we have to face a reality that is true. And looking around the regions, I share the sense of urgency of Australia. Peter Jennings has just elaborated. And Australia has been hit hard by Chinese economic statecraft of the thought, using economic leverage for the political purpose. And that's not new to us, that's not new to Japan. We have seen this for some time, whether it is a history agenda, or whether it is Senkaku agenda, or whatever, maritime agenda and so forth. It's always combined with other part of the economic leverages and so forth. And so, and also India, we see that some ambivalence on the part of India, but we have a common interest to defend the freedom and democracy of the thought. What matters today is exactly not necessarily limited to the territorial integrity of ours. China is looking at their own territorial integrity on their own grounds, but the important point is that if China will continue to export its governance model, attracting a lot of developing countries. If you look at what's happening in human rights commissions of the United Nations, a lot of countries, developing countries, did not agree to say something critical about China on the Hong Kong issues, in spite of the fact that this is a serious matter. And because I think they see the Chinese influence, the Chinese power, the economic help matters. But in looking at all these, we have to have some concerted effort. I don't say roll back, but we have to make sure that we would defend our own values the way we do govern and we do the diplomacy and fair and open and liberal. There was some discussion about the Europe. Yes, yesterday there was a European group discussing about these issues. That is true that their interest about China is more economic one, but gradually, as our Indian friend talked, that there is more interest and concern about the geopolitical landscape of Asia-Pacific. In spite of the fact that they will not be running in the forefront, they could be, be supported from the backyard. We would appreciate their interest and concern too. And ASEAN, I want to thank, Secretary of Philippines, that ASEAN's centrality and unity and independence does matter. And when there was a communist threat back during the Cold War, I think there was ASEAN to be created to safeguard against all these governance, challenges. Now I think it's again the challenge we face, not the similar one, but different one. But fundamentally, if it's come to the matter of values, I think there is something that we have to consider. And but having said all this one, I don't like the idea of total containment. I think we could expand the theater of collaboration with China, and we don't want to see Chinese people to be demonized by the Western powers or whatever you call it. And we want to be constructive together with China. And there could be a lot of things China could do. Mentioned there was a reference to environment and health, even trade. I understand that there are all these distorting measures China still have today, and these have to be rectified. We have to put the things on the equal and reciprocal ground. I think China does recognize it. Good people do recognize it, but it will be taking time, as we did even in Japan back in 1980s. So I think we have some understanding about it. Is China going to be part of arms control, nuclear issues? And that's also the subject of matter. We'd like to see China one day realize that it's useless to compete and spending a lot of money on the nuclear arsenal. But before coming to that point, I think we have to increase our own deterrence. That is also the reality. And I hope that the Chinese government and people would understand what's happening now is very critical in terms of dictating the future of China. I hope that all this discussion today will be of help for China to understand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sasa, and thank you for all the panelists for their quite comprehensive and broad-ranging views. As moderator, I'm facing a huge challenge to ask relevant questions, picking up from your interventions. So what I'd like to do is maybe I'd like to pick up maybe 3 broad areas for further discussions. I think one framework to look at this, well, maybe general would say I shouldn't call it US-China competition or confrontation, but there have been discussions about how to see this current situation. Is it more about military security, confrontation or rivalry or economic competition, or it's more about ideology? That was also coming up also yesterday, regime, norms, core values. These are maybe intermixed in this current situation of the US-China relations, particularly affecting this region. And I think we are also going back to Dr. Miyashima's framework of how to look at this situation from historical point of view. And a bit related to this is that there was also, well, how to call it? Should it be considered as Cold War version 2, or is it rivalry? Is it so different because the economic relations with China are so different from the time of the Cold War situation? Or is it making things even worse or difficult because of these economic leverages that could be used in terms of statecraft moves? That may be one big first category of my questions. And the second one is, China itself may not be seeing itself to be becoming competitor, challenger, or regional hegemon in that sense. But from the surrounding countries, the US, other countries, China's actions, China's language, narratives, all these things combined are leading to inevitable view that was expressed by many panelists today. Maybe I'll also throw in the third element. Well, again, going back to these 2 questions. So if the competition or the rivalry or the confrontation is about norms, values, ideologies, again, democratic countries like ours also may need to ask about our own democracies, our own social economic situations, and challenges to democracies coming not only from outside but inside. I think Mr. Joshi and some others also raised these points. So without taking so much time, maybe Professor Zhang might wish to say a few words or more than a few words in response to particularly General McMaster's debate or other points raised by other panel members. So I would first give the floor to Dr. Zhang and any other panelists who may want to jump in after that. So Professor Zhang first, please.
Thank you. It's too difficult to ask or answer such complex questions and issues. So I just try, as I mentioned at the beginning, what kind of world we want to have in the future. And really, our world is now in a turning point. We have a confrontation between the so-called democracy and authoritarianism, or CPP. I had a very good impression and memory of General McMaster, but today I listen again of your former State Secretary Pimple's talk about all the problems coming from CPP. So do remember that CPP led China for several decades. We'll celebrate its 100 years today, this year. So you can't separate, I think, at least now or in the future, you expect on the CPP and China. So the approach is for us for the future. And on the one hand, we need cooperation because China is a giant. On the other hand, China need to be changed or is willing to change only we sit together. If you see the past experience, and you may think that China has not changed, even go to the different direction. But personally, as a person who worked within China and promote this China's reform and opening, and spend all my life to promote the regional cooperation in past decades, I personally believe this is the only approach for us to sit together, to talk, to negotiate the agreements, which we follow, all of us, rather than, we sit on the opposite and call down or take the harsh actions from each side, and that's only force the government and party to go to defend us stronger. So it's not a way to let China to continue to improve. Also, it's not just the problem between U.S. and China. As Sakai-san said, is let the Chinese leaders and government and to understand it's what you are facing. I think we are fully understand, but the problem is how we find a way how to move to a better world rather than a dangerous world. And the final question is, I don't think, as I mentioned, that China wants to dominate, wants to launch a war, wants to gain what it will do again. So as a lot of, if you said that's a lot of misunderstandings, I think there's also probably a lot of misunderstandings from outside world. So this is why I spent all life long in China, and I studied in the US, and it's the work for promote China's change. So this is another way to do. Now I think the problem is almost accepted today. We're still open for discuss of it. Close down all the possible changes and which I think it's really dangerous for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Actually, listening to your remarks right now, I think there was also some connection to what I think Dr. Miyashima said at the beginning, what China or Chinese regime wants to do, and how it will be seen or interpreted. In this context, I think there is also, you also mentioned the kind of how to improve the situation. I think many other panelists may also wish to also talk about not only discussing the current situation, but how to make some adjustment, improvement, or some way out of decreasing the risks or confrontation or even misunderstandings. So any other panelists who may wish to make their remarks? I think, yes, Dr. Miyashima, yes, please. You are the first to speak, so you have also probably missed the opportunity to respond to the others. So please go ahead, Dr. Miyashima.
Thank you. When you, Tomiko, posed the question, your initial question, you said, is the competition between the United States and China, or China and its neighbors, basically a military one, an economic one, or an ideological one? And I think that the military competition and the economic competition go together. And when you put the military and economic dimensions together, basically you're arguing that it's a competition about power. It's all about the balance of power. And that's distinctly different from focusing on ideology. And what strikes me listening to people talk is the emphasis on ideology. General McMaster, for sure, basically sees this as a case of communism versus liberal democracy. But if you listen to almost everybody else speak, they talk about democracies this, democracies that. And the competition is couched very much in ideological terms. And I think that's simply wrong. This is not an ideological competition. This is a good old-fashioned competition for hegemony in Asia. And let me just say a few more words about that. With regard to the argument that this is all about communism, China has been a communist state since the 1970s, when we formed an alliance with China against the Soviet Union. We had no difficulty dealing with communist China in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and in the early 2000s. In fact, Mao Zedong is one of the greatest mass murderers in history, and Richard Nixon and all sorts of American leaders fell all over themselves being nice to Mao Zedong. And we got along very well with communist China. The more important point is we only should wish that China were a communist state. The problem is it's not a communist state, it's a capitalist state. And the Chinese are as good at playing capitalism as the Americans are. We are in for a really rocky future, because this is a country that has 4 times the population of the United States, 4 times the population of the United States, and has proved that because it can play the capitalist game and because it's not engaged in pursuing a communist economic system, that it might end up with a per capita GNP like South Korea or Hong Kong or Taiwan, in which case it will be far more powerful than us. We should only wish it was a communist state. So my point to General McMaster is that it may be nominally a communist state, but it is not a communist state in any meaningful way. And if it is true that it was has been a communist state in a meaningful way, we certainly were able to get along with it in the past. The reason that we can't get along with it today, what has changed, is the balance of power. The balance of power has shifted, and China now has the wherewithal to become a regional hegemon. Furthermore, just to say a word or two about the Americans, when people talk about liberal democracy, they talk as if liberal democracies were peace-loving countries. Nothing could be further from the truth. The United States is one of the most ruthless great powers in modern history. The idea that, we're some peace-loving country, and at this point in time, the United States is addicted to war. It's been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. We fought 7 different wars since the Cold War ended. The idea that we're a peace-loving state, we run around the world toppling regimes. But anyway, again, this is not a competition over ideology. It's a competition over power. And with regard to Beijing, I've spent a considerable amount of time in China. I've spoken to lots of Chinese leaders over time, and the Chinese are realists par excellence. These are my kind of people. I often like to joke that when I go to China and I give talks, I often open my talks by saying, it's good to be back among my people. And I don't speak a word of Chinese. Culturally, I'm like a fish out of water in China. But the fact is that the Chinese are realists par excellence. And what they're doing is they're acting according to the realist playbook. And they intend to dominate Asia. They tend to build a blue water navy and project power all over the world, just like the United States does. And as I said to you before, I don't blame them one bit. But this is not being driven by ideology. This is just good old-fashioned balance of power politics.
If I could interject, I mean, thanks, John. I think one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party loved you, John, is because you're really not a realist. You're an ideologue. Because what you engage in is really a form of moral equivalency that is fundamentally ahistorical, and it is I think it is a sort of a what I would call the phenomenon of strategic narcissism, in which we define the world only in relation to us, and then attribute all causality to what the United States does as a warlike nation. For example, we went to war in Afghanistan. Because why? Because we were on the receiving end of the most devastating terrorist attack in history. Now, you would say, well, the reason that happened is because we were engaged in the Middle East, and our presence there just offended so many Muslims. They had no other option but to commit these mass murder attacks. So I would say you apply that same kind of ideological interpretation to China, and that's where it's fundamentally flawed. I think what's important is to recognize the party is driven by an ideology, which is an ideology to remain in power. Now, it's not, this isn't the party of Mao Zedong, where he murdered millions of his own citizens to stay in power. This is kind of, as you mentioned, with the capitalist dimension to it, this is the Diet Coke of communism. It's just 1 calorie. Maybe it's not communist enough. But what this ideological deficiency in the party does is it drives a real sense of fear of losing the party's exclusive grip on power. And this is where they are very darn realistic, John, they're doing everything they can to extend and tighten their exclusive grip on power by the perfection of their Orwellian technologically enabled surveillance police state. And I bet they love that you give them cover for these kind of actions when you say, hey, I'm just one of you guys. When you put millions of people in concentration camps, when you arrest anyone who has the temerity to criticize the party, when you build the Great Firewall higher and higher while you expel foreign journalists, while you extend this repression to Hong Kong, I just don't think that there is a moral equivalency there. And hey, we have, and this gets to the earlier question, we have problems in our democracies, right? We do. I mean, we just saw it with our assault on the Capitol, the polarization divisions with our society. But what we have going for us, I think, is that we have the ability to self-correct below the level of revolution, because we all have a say in how we're governed. There are many also who say, John, the Chinese, man, I mean, they're just culturally predisposed for not wanting a say, in how they're governed. And of course, it's Taiwan that gives the big lie to that. And this is one of the reasons why the party's obsessed with Taiwan in a way that I think is increasingly dangerous. So I would just say it's important to understand the emotions, the ideology that drive and constrain the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's a combination of fear, as I mentioned, and ambition. Ambition to take center stage in the world, to achieve the vision of national rejuvenation, and the two are linked. because the promises made to the Chinese people are promises made of increased prosperity as a way to maintain control and appealing to sort of base nationalist emotion as a way to maintain support for the party. So, John, I would disagree that the party's not ideologically driven, but I would agree with you that it's not the Maoist ideology that's driving it.
Well, we are having a very interesting intra-US discussions, but and we may be able to.
No, this is for everyone. This is for everybody, because this is the discussion. I mean, with John's point, John is delivering the talking points of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you very much. I think the one unique situation that we face with the current situation in Indo-Pacific, and maybe not trying to bridge the discussions between two giant powers right now, maybe this combination of Chinese system of communism, whether we call it or not is maybe a question, but communism plus capitalism, and they are successful in delivering economic results while maintaining a totally different style of governance. That may be a unique challenge that we are facing right now. But anyway, let me invite other speakers from the region. I think Mr. Jennings, you may have been wishing to speak for a while.
Oh, I've always got lots of opinions to share. Look, a very interesting exchange between HR and John, and I do think that it is possible to underestimate the extent to which ideology still is a core factor in how the Communist Party thinks about itself. But what Xi Jinping has done, I think, has been to emphasize the Leninist aspect of Marxist-Leninism at the expense of Marxism, if I can put it that way. And the Communist Party is very definitely a Leninist party. So in my presentation, I was using the term authoritarianism, which I think is now a central global problem, that there is a style of government emerging in China and Russia and a few other places, enabled by a modern technology, which makes the potential for authoritarianism to be implemented much more comprehensively across populations than was ever really the case in the previous century. And that is a competition about which we should be concerned, because we're at a moment where I think Xi Jinping is able to make the claim to many countries, our system is superior. Look at our management of COVID. Look at the internal problems of the democracies. I think that is a message that has more appeal than we might actually give it credit for. Tomiko, your sort of three earlier questions, I'll just touch on very briefly. Where is this a competition? Well, we're all aware of the risk for this to become a military competition, but fundamentally right now, I think the battleground is around technology. And it seems to me that is the area in the next half decade or so where we are going to find a stronger delineation of two global camps as we seek to give ourselves the space to not be dominated by China seeking to control emerging technology. Now, how that then plays into national security issues, how that plays into economic cooperation issues, that is, I think, going to be one of the challenges. Is this a Cold War? Look, I think it's possible to be too diverted into discussions of what the old Cold War looked like and the new Cold War is like. It is certainly not peace. And I think we are, from an Australian perspective, we rather think we've been in a serious fight with the PRC for quite some time now. And I think this is only going to get worse, and it's only going to impact on more countries around the world. So we probably need a better phrase, but I think a new Cold War is not a bad way to describe where we're at. And you know, it is a very clear, full-on competition in a number of areas, including technology, in the cyber domain, in space, underwater. You know, the elements of this a definitive competition between two camps, I think, is now becoming stronger and stronger. And then finally, Tomiko, you mentioned the challenges to the democracies. I do think there is now a quite serious internal challenge to a number of democracies. The rise of what I have called post-policy politics, where the ability to develop and think through coherent policy settings seems to be becoming harder and harder for democratic systems. And the disaffection of our own populations from our political systems, I think, is immensely concerning. So if the democracies are to work more closely together, if we are to be able to present a credible alternative to the sort of Leninist-inspired authoritarianism we see coming from China and elsewhere, we are going to have to work on how to sort of resuscitate our democratic systems to make our own people believe in them more credibly. I just observe that there is nothing like a challenge or nothing like a threat to kind of make democratic systems work more effectively. And so perhaps the threat is what's actually going to turn us into, the sorts of coherent societies we would like to be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jennings. Let me continue to collect more views from the region. Ambassador Albert and then Mr. Joshi, please.
Very interesting to hear these points of view. But I would have to speak in terms of the region. ASEAN really, if you look at how it works, has no wish to renounce what its neighbors can do to improve the lives of its people. That's its focus. While it is true that we have larger trade and investment relations with the United States, we look at China as a possibility to even improve on that ground. While we do not wish to stymie the relationship with China in terms of our trade and investment, we also want what the United States wants: peace and stability in the region, rules-based society. If you look at the composition of ASEAN, you have Vietnam as a communist state, but still is able to be with the rest of ASEAN, work with ASEAN. And because I think ASEAN has provided mechanisms precisely to address a lot of these competing, I wouldn't call it ideologies, but could be competing for influence in the region, a way to check on others, what they're doing in the region. And again, I go back, we have been working hard at providing these mechanisms. I hear everybody talking about dialogue, about cooperation, and we feel that these open-ended mechanisms that we have initiated in the region do have had a wonderful opportunity for everybody to come in together and bring forward what they would wish to do in vis-a-vis the rest of the region. I think that I heard the word containment. It has come in many of the ASEAN dialogues. Precisely, we have, and I said, we want an open and free and inclusive region. We have these mechanisms, and we just hope that they can be more useful to everybody as a platform to bring forth all these competing ideas, how to manage, how to get to that situation where you have, on the one hand, the U.S. desire for peace, stability, rules-based society. I mean, the Philippines brought China to the arbitration court, which is a manifestation of how we believe in these possibilities to address these competing interests in the region.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. In this region, we often talk about the ASEAN way. And you really explain the wisdom of a ASEAN way in this very difficult and increasingly maybe more difficult region. So may I also ask some point of view from India, from Mr. Joshi?
Thank you, ICHIKAWA-san. Let me say that the exchange between General McMaster and Professor Ishmael actually made a very relevant point, the exchange itself. Now, that is why we as democracies value America. You can't have the general and the professor disagree in an international forum on a core issue. That is what democracies are all about. We would like to see these debates take place publicly in China as well. That is what democracy is all about. So when we speak of ideological differences, when we speak of core differences, yes, there are fundamental issues at stake here. We are today moving into a world where global financial flows, where data flows connect us all together so intricately. You cannot have different norms in different countries governing how these are going to be regulated, how governments are going to interact with their own citizens and with other citizens with regard to all of these. So yes, technology, finance, these all bring core issues which will need to be addressed between countries. If China wishes to be part of it, we are all willing as democracies to settle down, talk about norms where there is commonality, because the world has moved. This is not like the old Cold War, because technology, finance are major game changers which have changed the shape of the world we are living in today. And that brings me to my next point. Where do we go from here? Indo-Pacific, we've been talking about the Indo-Pacific. See, there is a strong convergence on many of these issues between the nations in the region. And the Indo-Pacific, and because of the number of land and maritime disputes in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, where unfortunately China seems to be at the center of the maximum number of these disputes. So the Indo-Pacific, by default, yes, does become a kind of security architecture. But I also see that as its greatest weakness. Because the convergence between the nations in the region must actually move forward and get onto that very critical second leg. The big rival someone spoke about, the Eurasian project and the Indo-Pacific project. Yes, there is Eurasian project, which is a rival to the Indo-Pacific. And the Eurasian project, exemplified in the BRI, runs on very strong economic legs. So that is where the Indo-Pacific needs to confront a larger geoeconomic, geostrategic vision, which then can take on, yes, China can be part of it. China, there will be a discussion on norms. There will be a discussion on how we're going to be interacting with the larger questions of finance, with data, and the larger issue of freedom of people. That becomes a core ideological issue we will engage with. But I think the Indo-Pacific needs to expand its contours and move into that framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi, for your wonderful way of describing how democracy works. I think coupled with the remarks by Mr. Jennings about authoritarian regimes, that might be one framework that we may able to maybe agree on a bit as a framework. Maybe using the prerogative of the organizer, I think I have to also ask Ambassador Sasai to make some remarks from Japanese point of view.
Yes, in Asia, there is this history of democratic evolutions. More than 30, 40 years ago, many countries were not democratic at all. We know it, right? Including some ASEAN friends. Some countries started from very much authoritarian regime. And there was economic development going together with that one. Then gradually, some countries turn into a kind of democracy. It might not be fully fledged democracy. Look at Singapore. Singapore is acting like advanced country these days. But if you really look into some of the institutional arrangement, can you define the same democracy as we are? So there could be some debate. And there was Vietnam cases. Well, Myanmar is kind of given attention now. But over 10 years, even Myanmar is making progress. So the question is that how do you view all this time taking place? When there was the debate about China, could this capitalism go work together with communist or totalitarian regime? There was a debate. One day, there could be enormous sort of, tensions between the economic freedom. Say some Chinese companies are faced with enormous pressure coming from the communist government. And so there could be some cooperation, but at the same time, there could be some divergence of interest even inside China. So my view is that possibly when we look at China, China is also looking at the longer time frame, and the question how long could we sustain? And if you look at the country like the Cambodian Laos, it's increasing in the realm of influence of China today. And if you go there are lots of Chinese, business people and investment there. But there are also some other investment from Singapore and Australia and Japan and the United States. United States investment is still big, and people don't talk about it. Of course, trade-wise, a lot of countries are depend upon China. That is true. But in terms of cumulative, investment of the thought, United States would continue to be a good economic power, and including currencies. China is working on the new currency of Chinese way. Could that be independent from dollars? We are not quite sure about it. So I think there is a competition aspect of all this one. But as we move on, the problem as we see today is a Chinese tendency of moving from more liberal part of the governance to more authoritarian. We can't really definitively say that one day, after 2 or 3 years after their party convention and so forth, if the power is solidified, there could be more room for the discussion. Is this the way we will continue to go forward? So my hope is that there could be some more transparency of the debates, not simply limited to party leaders. Make all debates open to the public. And that would give more sort of, the assurance to the others of what the real debate inside China. China is too much defensive over the years in terms of their own experience of the history. All this, insistence on non-interventions into affairs, whether Xinjiang or Hong Kong or whatever, is coming from their own historical experience. So we have to take all this into factor, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't necessarily appreciate what the China is now heading for in terms of domestic governance and also its extension of the forces. Nowadays, several years ago, we are told by Chinese government that introductions of aircraft carrier from Russia was for casino. We didn't believe it, but 3 or 4 years after, it began to be changed. There is a aircraft carrier, and 1, 2, 3. It's not offensive. We don't know. So there is this genuine concern, and this is not simply the concern of ideology, as Professor Scheinman said. It's more of power configurations. And in envisaging all these power configurations in the region, it is obvious that we need to increase our own deterrence. This is not really offensive, and that needs to be understood. But depending on how China would come around, extending its forces to the Western Pacific and closing to Hawaii or whatever the place, it looks like China is becoming more big power. but at the same time, China might be losing some of the support they might be getting. So that's my concern. So there has to be some mechanism of restraining all this power projection in the future. That is easy to say and difficult to do, but at the meaning of debate like this would give the opportunity for everybody to think what could be the best for everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sasai. And actually, I see the faces of many panelists who may wish to speak again. Actually, we are reaching the time to close this session. I personally wish that we may continue 1 hour or 2 hours more, but unfortunately, we have to also respect the limitation of the time for this session. But I personally learned a lot in these sessions, and also quite a wide range of views were expressed. And the meaning of this kind of session, like Ambassador Sasai just said, is really to provide the platform for dialogue. It's why this not only this session, but this event is called the Tokyo Global Dialogue. So we would wish to continue this dialogue after the end of this session into several months to come and also to next year. And we hope that we can have live debate next year in Tokyo. So with that, unfortunately, I cannot give floor to any of the panelists anymore, but we would like to thank all the panelists' participation and contribution to this panel. And I have to declare that we have to close this closing plenary session. Thank you very much for all your insights and contribution to the panel. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
はい、これにてクロージング
This would like to bring an end to the closing plenary session. And with this, I'd like to declare that we have finished all the schedule for the second Tokyo Global Dialogue. Now, on behalf of the organizer, from Keiichiro Sasai, president of JIIA, he's going to deliver the closing remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending the second Tokyo Global Dialogue held over these past 3 days. We thank you indeed for your participation. Of course, we did experience some technical issues which could not be avoided due to the online holding of this event, but we received such a large participation from so many people, not only from within Japan, but from overseas. And I'm sure that you have thoroughly enjoyed this very rich discussion amongst experts and practitioners representing both Japan and overseas. In the opening session, Prime Minister Suga and Foreign Minister Motegi delivered messages as well as foreign policy speeches, which were very closely related to the topic of this dialogue, that is the Indo-Pacific of today and tomorrow. And after that, we had many sessions which undertook sectoral and regional analysis of these themes to provide us with a very deep insight into each theme. And I'm quite happy that each of these themes were discussed from various angles and with much width and scope. I myself learned a lot from these discussions. And of course, I talked about the role of think tanks within the tumultuous international situation during the opening session. and also from the viewpoint of strengthening the communication or external communication of messages both in English and Japanese. I think in both senses, this was a very, very valuable event. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the members of JIIA and others who have been so instrumental in the preparation and operation of this conference. And based on the findings and our learnings from the first and second meeting, we would like to, in terms of content and formality, further enrich and improve the Tokyo Global Dialogue as well as our strategic annual report. And we also promise to enhance the diversity, gender balance, etc. of the panelists. In terms of gender balance, there may have been some sessions where we were not able to achieve a balance. And initially, we had actually banked on the participation of many more women panelists, but they had to excuse themselves for various reasons which we could not control. So in any event, in order to overcome this gender balance, we are working very hard so that we can improve the situation next year. So we are looking forward to a better balance next time. And I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank you for your patronage and for your support of the activities of the JIIA over the years. And I do ask for your continued support and your assistance so that the JIIA may flourish even further in the future. So that closes my closing address. Thank you so very much.